Even without technology, without stores to rely on, and without any of the support systems we take for granted today, medieval peasants still survived famine, war, disease, and winters longer than a person's entire memory. And they didn't do it by luck, but through a survival system so durable that even the modern world can barely replace it. What surprises most people is that these so-called primitive skills were built on direct observation, repeated trial and error, and generations of persistence, forming a survival map they never named, but depended on every single day to keep their families alive. In their world, mistakes weren't something you fixed tomorrow. They were the price you paid within the season. So every action, from storing food to staying warm, from treating illness to protecting the home, was rooted in a mindset where failure simply wasn't an option. The harshness of their environment forced them to optimize every tiny resource, understand exactly what their bodies could endure, and prepare as if winter could stretch one more month at any moment. And if you think these ancient methods were buried long ago, you might be shocked to learn that thousands of off-grid families and homesteaders today are quietly relearning every technique and every small trick their ancestors left behind. If you want to understand why such an old system has survived this long, keep watching. Because what comes next will make you look at your own modern life in a completely different way. For medieval people, water wasn't something you could waste or take lightly, because just a single rainless week or a summer that ran longer than expected could push an entire family into despair faster than any famine. With no deep wells, no pumps, no filtration systems, they had to turn every rainfall into a lifeline, using simple techniques that demanded absolute precision. Thatched or wooden roofs built at the perfect angle to catch the maximum amount of rain, hollowed wood or clay channels, guiding the flow into storage barrels. And the barrel openings always covered with leaves, cloth, or moss, to keep debris out before it could turn clean water into a threat. One tiny mistake, like leaving a barrel uncovered on a hot day, was enough to contaminate the whole supply. And in a world without medicine, dirty water was deadlier than hunger. Countless people died of dysentery long before they ever felt true starvation. To store water longer, they buried clay jars in pits lined with wax or packed with clay, where darkness and cool air slowed rot and bacterial growth. And when the rain stopped, they immediately switched to a strict conservation mode. Clean water for drinking, used water cycled again for cooking, gardening, or washing. That caution wasn't paranoia, it was survival experience. And it was these exact methods that allowed entire communities to make it through the harshest droughts. If you're curious how this system held up under even more extreme conditions, the next part will give you the answer. When a medieval winter descended, the cold didn't just slip through the cracks. It hovered right at the edge of the bed, waiting for the smallest mistake to take an entire family's life. Without large stores of firewood, without sealed fireplaces like we have today, people had to rely on heating methods that seemed simple, but left no room for error. Half-sunken houses weren't built for style. They existed because the surrounding earth held warmth better than any wooden wall. Even with snow packed over the roof, the inside stayed dozens of degrees, warmer than the outside. But the real lifesaver was something few people ever think about: the bed itself. They laid down thick layers of straw to block the cold rising from the ground, piled wool, furs, and multiple linen layers to trap heat, and heated stones for hours before slipping them under the blankets. Stones that often became the thin line between life and death. If the stones cooled too quickly, if the straw layer was too thin,
Look at these
or if
markings.
even a sliver of wind slipped
There are
through
more
a
over
window
there,
seam,
deeper down.
the room could drop to hypothermic temperatures within hours. And here's the twist most people don't believe until they see historical records. It wasn't the blizzards or freezing winds that killed fastest, but simply sleeping a few steps away from the warm spot. The air 20-30 centimeters above the ground was always colder, and anyone who drifted outside the heat zone could freeze to death before dawn, even if the rest of the room stayed mildly warm. That's why they slept pressed together, children in the middle, adults around them, and even livestock sometimes bedding down near the hearth to boost the shared warmth. It may sound extreme, but back then, keeping heat meant keeping life. Feel free to share how you think you'd handle a night like that in the comments. Your perspective might just surprise you. For medieval people, cooking wasn't just preparing dinner. It was a survival equation where every stick of firewood was worth its weight in gold, because burning too much on a colder than expected day could mean starving before winter ended. That's why they relied on clay ovens, tools that looked primitive but were far more sophisticated than most modern people realize. A clay oven needed only a small bundle of wood to heat up, and once it reached the right temperature, its thick clay walls held heat for hours, allowing them to cook
Careful
multiple
now. Only take
dishes
the leaves
without
from the
relighting
younger
the
plants.
fire.
Yes, we understand.
But that efficiency came with risk. Put bread in too early, and the oven wasn't hot enough,
Carefully,
leaving the
take
dough
only what you need.
undercooked. And in a world without refrigeration or medicine, half-cooked food could lead to deadly poisoning. Wait too long, and the temperature would drop fast, leaving stews underdone and forcing them to burn more wood. A decision that could cost the family days of survival at the end of winter. For those without a clay
right here.
oven, there was the earth pit method.
What do you make of this pattern?
Superheated stones
It's definitely
dropped into a
not
pit
natural.
lined with leaves and soil. But even this carried danger. One small gap in the covering, or a stone that cracked from thermal shock, could ignite nearby straw and burn down the entire cooking area. To save firewood, many villages cooked communally, sharing ovens and splitting the meals, because the fewer fires burned, the more people survived. In that world, cooking wasn't a simple domestic task. It was the art of preserving warmth and preserving life in the same breath. For medieval people, foraging wasn't a weekend outdoor activity. It was a core survival skill, where confusing two leaves could decide the fate of an entire season. They understood that no matter how full the storage barn was, there would always be years of blight, drought, or early winters when every plan collapsed, and the shrubs at the forest edge or the damp meadow plants became the final safety net. From childhood,
now.
kids
Breathe
were taught
deep.
to identify
It is
nettle,
time.
sorrel,
It is
wild
coming.
garlic, dandelion,
Be strong.
and chickweed by scent and leaf veins, because one mistake, especially during seasonal transitions, could mean stumbling into plants whose toxins were deadlier than hunger itself. Some greens were edible only before flowering, others only safe during the first few weeks of spring. And as for mushrooms, most were avoided entirely unless guided by someone deeply experienced, because a single wrong cap could drop an entire family within hours. They learned to soak, boil, or dry plants to neutralize toxins, and to rotate foraging spots so they wouldn't destroy their own food source. What's striking is that
hunting
they
party has
didn't treat
returned.
foraging as a backup plan.
I can
It
hear
was
them.
an essential layer of security, a skill that, if missing, could throw a household into despair after just a few weeks of crop failure. Today, many survivalists and off-gridders are relearning these exact techniques, proving that sometimes the future is built on the memory of the old forest. In the medieval world, food preservation wasn't just a daily chore. It was almost a secret ritual, where every movement carried the silent fear that one wrong step could turn the entire winter into a death sentence. Everyone knew fresh meat was the quickest traitor. Leave it in warm air for a few hours or hang it too close to damp ash, and it would change smell, change color, and become more dangerous than any spear. A single spoiled cut could bring down an entire family in days. With dry goods, the threat was even quieter. Grain had to be dried to a precise degree, then buried in clay silos or lime-lined pits. Cold, dark chambers people whispered about as if they had souls of their own. Because if just one night of moisture slipped in, the grain would sprout or rot, and the saying, damp grain for one night, an entire village starves 3 months later, wasn't exaggeration. It was the hard-earned truth of countless generations. Even insects were mythical enemies. They could crawl into a grain sack, lay eggs, and wipe out the whole store in a single night without making a sound. So people scattered cold ash around storage areas, hung bundles of insect-repelling herbs, and inspected every bag by torchlight as if searching for something invisible. To them, preserving food wasn't a technique. It was a form of protection, a way to keep life itself anchored through the winter. If you've ever wondered why these ancient methods have endured for so long, feel free to share your thoughts. Because sometimes survival isn't just in the food, but in the memory of the hands that kept it alive for 1,000 years. In the medieval world, getting sick wasn't something you complained about to pass the day. It was a chilling warning that even a small scratch could kill you within 48 hours, because there was no penicillin, no hospitals, and no second chances.
Quiet.
People relied on whatever the earth gave them. Garlic to fight infection, honey to keep wounds from festering, willow bark to lower fevers, vinegar to wash away pus, and crushed comfrey or plantain. Leaves pressed onto the skin as a fragile hope. But it was also a world where mistaking one plant for another meant dying faster than from the original illness. Confusing a poisonous root with a healing one wasn't rare, and many families lost loved ones because of a single decision made in the dark. The desperation was clearest during childbirth. Every birth was a coin toss between life and death, with a 50-50 chance for both mother and child. Midwives were the guardians of ancient knowledge, using breath, herbs, and inherited experience to pull lives back from the edge. But sometimes all they could do was look to the sky and accept what couldn't be changed. People survived on herbs, not because they were as powerful as modern medicine, but because they had no other option, and because they were forced to understand every scent, every taste, every reaction of the body. And through that harsh necessity, they built a body of knowledge that herbalists and off-grid communities still study today. If you think you could survive in such a world, feel free to share your thoughts, because sometimes your perspective helps someone else grasp just how unforgiving that reality truly was. In the medieval world, defense wasn't the job of warriors or knights. It was the responsibility of every peasant, because any night could be the night when a dog's sudden bark signaled that fate was approaching. Without steel swords or armor, they turned whatever they had around them into a shield for their lives. Thick hawthorn, and blackthorn hedges that formed natural walls of thorns, sharp enough to tear an intruder apart before he could even step through. Zigzag entry paths designed to slow an enemy for just a few seconds, long enough for someone inside the house to shift the balance. Doors were reinforced with heavy crossbars. Windows were placed high to reduce vulnerabilities. And above the main entrance, there was often a drop hole for stones, hot water, or even a pot of boiling soup. Crude weapons, but brutally effective. When danger truly struck, a village didn't fight as scattered individuals. They moved as a single body, blowing horns to alert each other, hiding children and food stores, then surrounding the intruder with farm tools, hoes, billhooks, oak clubs, objects that looked like tools for tilling soil, but could end an invasion in just a few breaths. The most frightening part wasn't the attack itself, but their quiet unity. Because when an entire village rose together, even the strongest enemy had to hesitate. In the medieval world, survival didn't rest only on grain, dry firewood, or layers of insulating straw. It also depended on something far more invisible: the collective mental strength a village created together to fight the fear that threatened to erode every hope they had. When crops failed, when disease swept through, or when war dragged on without end, peasants didn't simply curl up and wait. They built communal rituals that were almost political in their own way. Fire nights, ancient songs, torchlit processions around the village, all meant to declare to the land and sky that they were still standing.
There are more over there.
Solstices and equinoxes weren't just natural markers. They were performances of collective power, moments when lighting fires, carrying candles, or speaking prayers became not just spiritual acts, but declarations of sovereignty against darkness and cold. Stories passed down by elders, tales of ancestors who survived the Great Flood, the White Winter, or the Black Famine, served as reminders that today's suffering was just one chapter in a vast cycle they were obligated to continue. Even faith took on the color of survival. A prayer before a meal wasn't only gratitude, it was a promise that they would not break under the weight of hardship. And when death drew near, final rites helped preserve dignity, reassure the living, and strengthen the belief that the community remained stronger than fate itself. It was in these moments, when spirit became the final shield, that you truly see why they endured nights longer than fear itself. What shocks most modern people isn't that medieval peasants survived centuries of chaos. It's how they built an entire survival system without ever giving it a fancy name. They didn't talk about being off-grid. They didn't discuss prepping. And they certainly didn't boast about resource optimization. They simply did whatever it took to keep their families from being swallowed by winter, war, or disease.
Carefully,
the things we now label as special skills, collecting rainwater, staying warm with shared body heat, cooking with residual heat, seasonal foraging, preserving food with ash and earth, healing with leaves, defending with thorn hedges, were to them just everyday life. Habits refined over hundreds of years. Wisdom carried in every story whispered by torchlight.
It's definitely
and here's
not
the hook
natural.
most people miss. They weren't stronger than us, nor smarter, but they understood something the modern world has forgotten. Stability is an illusion, and survival is a skill you have to practice every single day. The closer you look, the more you realize their techniques are quietly returning. Homesteaders learning to earth insulate, preppers building root cellars, off-grid families cooking in clay ovens, and people seeking mental balance, turning back to seasonal rituals and herb gardens. The lesson isn't that we should live exactly as they did. It's that resilience comes from small, consistent habits that don't depend on machines. If you find these ancient skills worth thinking about, feel free to share your perspective below. Your viewpoint might spark a fascinating discussion. And if you want to explore how these old techniques are being revived today, don't forget to subscribe for the next stories.